Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 4th of April 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to have Vanessa Beeley with us as well.
Well, we're going to say welcome to Vanessa straight away. You're in Damascus at the moment. Vanessa, how are things over there at present?
Actually, I have to say they're pretty wonderful. I mean, peace has come back to Damascus. The streets when I arrived, the streets that I just walked up to get back to my hotel, the day I arrived were deserted. Today I could barely make my way up the street because it's just jam-packed with kids and people. It's wonderful to see. I mean, the mortars have ended. The daily deaths and mutilations, over 30,000 permanently disabled from those 6 years of mortars and rockets and shells being fired onto these city areas, residential areas since 2012. So extraordinary scenes. And, you know, reminiscent of Aleppo after a liberation, when we just saw people going back to their daily lives, and it's a wonderful sight, actually.
But it wasn't quite so wonderful when you arrived with mortars raining down, but clearly most of eastern Ghouta now has been liberated.
Yeah, the majority of eastern Ghouta is now fully liberated. That doesn't mean that there isn't now a huge amount of work to clear all of the mines and the booby traps and the explosives that have been left behind by the various terrorist factions. There are still a number of militants also to be evacuated from the remaining pocket of Douma. And of course, as many Syrians have said to me, the liberation is not going to be complete until all of the prisoners being held in what they call the repentance jails in Douma are finally set free.
Okay, well, look, that's the good news. Now, the not so good news is really summed up in this video clip here, because of course the testimony is starting to come out now from eastern Ghouta. Yeah. So let's start off with this lady. Now, I've just I'm not gonna let people hear what she has to say because she's speaking in Arabic, but she's talking about children being kidnapped. Five-year-old female child kidnapped while she was with her sister. A man who put on a veil from Jabhat al-Nusra kidnapped the child, and basically she goes on to say that this child was found in a container near a hospital with the child's organs removed, and she gives a couple of different examples of this. This is something, Vanessa, that you and I have been talking about for some time. It's something that you've been hearing for some time, and here we've got witness testimony that this is going on. What are people saying aside from this lady, and what do you know about this situation?
Well, Mike, I mean, what's extraordinary, I went to Jobar a couple of days ago, one of the liberated districts, and we actually entered the underground tunnels. Now, underneath all of eastern Ghouta, there is actually almost an underground city. There's no better way to describe it. Now, in those underground tunnels were discovered what can be loosely described as field hospitals or medical units. Now, we know from evidence from papers collected by journalists, Syrian journalists that have gone into those tunnels, that in particular Syrian American Medical Society, SAMS, were either operating directly inside eastern Ghouta, inside these underground hospitals, or they were paying and financing the medical operations in those tunnels. These stories of child abductees, you know, child kidnaps for organ trade are nothing new. As you rightly said, we heard very similar testimony in East Aleppo after the evacuation of the terrorists and the white helmets. But if we go to a report from the Director General of the Syrian Coroner's Office, who stated, we have accurate information that over 25,000 surgical operations have been conducted in the refugee camps of neighboring countries and in the terrorist-controlled areas in Syria since 2011. I think this report was actually over a year old. This report was put through to the UN, particularly to the UNHCR, who claim they knew nothing about it. But this, as I said, is a relatively common story that we hear in these terrorist-held areas. There's a thriving drug trade. That's another sideline of the terrorist groups, and child trafficking and child organ harvesting, or organ harvesting from dead and living people, is one of the greatest harvests of any conflict zone. And that's been demonstrated, for example, in Kosovo, and in a number of zones where the US coalition has previously intervened, or NATO has previously intervened.
Well, you mentioned the tunnels. We'll come on to those in a second, but we have here a little bit of video of your drive into Eastern Ghouta. This is into, where is this exactly? Jobar, did you say?
Yeah, this is into Jobar. I mean, what is interesting is, I think about a year ago, I actually went to what was the original Real Syria Civil Defense Center, which was right almost inside Jobar itself. And when I was in that building, I could only view Jobar through the tiny slits in the windows that had been left for the Syrian army to survey Jobar which had to be protected because of the sniper fire from Jobar, from the terrorists inside Jobar, which were predominantly Nusra Front. So it was, very interesting, having viewed what looked like a moonscape from outside Jobar, to finally be able to drive into Jobar and to see, I mean, just this horrifying devastation of this, what was largely a residential neighborhood. We actually had one lady accompany us who had come to try and find her home. She hadn't seen it for 7 years. But this, again, is only really, I suppose, maximum a couple of weeks after liberation. So you still, you're unable to go off the path that you're allowed to travel on because of the number of mines and explosives and booby traps that will be set in those houses that you're seeing that we're passing. So again, the area is not 100% safe, purely because of those booby traps that have been set by the terrorists before they leave, which is, that standard practice. We saw that in Aleppo. I can't remember the number of hectares that particularly the Russian sappers had to go in and clear before residents could move back into the area. And underneath all of this destruction, of course, as I mentioned, were built these underground cities, these labyrinths that we were able to go into.
The thing, Vanessa, the thing that staggers me about this little video, if you go and look on Steemit for this article, the Syrian Army discovered a city under a city in Ghouta, and I remember you being on this program probably about 18 months ago, talking about the tunnels under Damascus and so on, and when you were talking about it at the time, I was imagining images of the tunnels in Vietnam, where you're having to crawl through on hands and knees to get, and maybe they open up little rooms inside. But I mean, and I've shown this already, but this is the entrance to one of the tunnels, and this is you standing inside one of these tunnels. These are not dug by individuals with entrenching tools. These are major civil engineering projects.
Yeah, and a lot of the machinery, they're identifying all of the machinery that was used, but certainly France was a major player in this, and we can't forget that Lafarge, of course, terrorist faction. So, we can potentially speculate that their materials were used to help to manufacture these tunnels underground. I mean, they were extremely, as you say, well built. They were steel reinforced. They were in many places big enough for cars to drive through. As it says in that report, the militant commanders could drive underground and park underground and enter their houses safely without fear of being targeted by the Syrian army. Those tunnels, the ones that you showed very quickly in that video, were actually built by kidnap victims from Adra, which is an area to the northeast of eastern Ghouta. Now, Adra in 2013 was invaded by the terrorist factions. A number of civilians were massacred, a huge number. Some were actually burned inside the bread ovens in Adra. Many women and children were kidnapped from that area, and as you hear on that video, many of the male captives were used to actually build those tunnels, living underground for months without sunlight and basically chipping away, creating those tunnels. Many of those women and children that were kidnapped for Adra are feared to be still in prison inside Douma. I think now 3,500 kidnapped victims have been released, but the fears are that there are many more being held in these underground prisons, which are ironically called repentance prisons, where these people in Adra, they were predominantly Alawite, are supposed to, of course, learn to repent for being infidels. So these are the kind of extremist, brutal thugs that our government and our Western media has been supporting and lionizing and turning into rebel heroes and legitimizing as Syrian opposition.
Yeah. Okay, look, Vanessa, thank you very much for that. Stay with us because I want to get your comments on a couple of other things, but we'll move on, Brian, to Skripal then.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Vanessa, thank you very much for all the work you've been doing, Vanessa. I personally was shocked a few days ago to see that there were a number of people trying to discredit the excellent work that you've done, and well done for staying above all of that, because your reporting has been truly exceptional. And we, of course, know the danger that you've been through on occasions in getting as close to the coalface as possible. So just to thank you. Well, let's have a look at the Novichok story, because I called it fantasy last week. I stay on fantasy, or at least a fairy story, and my goodness, this is beginning to develop quite nicely. So yesterday, Russia Today, of course, was rather crowing, and I'm not surprised that Porton Down scientists had gone public saying that they couldn't confirm that Novichok, the Novichok used on the Skripals, was made in Russia. So we've had the British government absolutely hammering Russia, saying we know, we know. Of course, no evidence has been coming forth at all to back this up. And now it's emerging that there is no evidence to connect it with Russia.
Well, and indeed, Boris Johnson caught in a direct lie, because when he was speaking to Deutsche Welt in Germany, he said that the Porton Down, the people he had been speaking to in Porton Down had absolutely definitively said that it had come from Russia. Yeah,
this is correct, Mike. And I think that it's very interesting that this interview by Sky News, which was embedded in the Russia Today article, but I watched it and I just found it fascinating, because you can see the chief executive of Porton Down blush scarlet as he is being interviewed. It's quite incredible. In fact, if you freeze this and have a look at the image on the screen, you'll see that his face, and particularly that exposed size of his neck, is beetroot red.
But this is not embarrassment.
I think this is huge pressure, Mike, because I think this man is having to be so careful with his words. Of course, what he says is he's admitting that Porton Down can't attribute the Novichok to Russia. He says it's military grade nerve agent, but they cannot attribute it to Russia. I think a total of 20 possible other agencies, nationalities capable of producing it are mentioned, but he is very quick to say they, and who's he talking about when he says they? He's talking about the British government. So it's divided into we, Porton Down, can say that this is factually correct information, but they, the British government, are effectively saying it was the Russians. And to show how bad it is, let's choose one MP. He's been he's appeared to quite some extent on the media. John Glenn, Conservative Party and the representative for Salisbury, he says this: "I have no doubt whatsoever that Russia was behind the attempted murders. What you've seen today is one piece of the jigsaw from Porton Down, world-class scientists, but what they're not able to do is interpret and understand the human activity that accompanied what led up to the awful events here in Salisbury." So I've left on the address for that particular Daily Mail article so that you can follow it through. He goes on, he says it's the combination of those two things together which give the compelling evidence that the Prime Minister took to our allies and was acted upon. I've put in the what was acted upon, Mr. Glenn, because we still don't know what has been acted upon. I don't really mind what propaganda emerges from the Kremlin following this interview this afternoon. What we have got to think about is what the overall picture is and what actually happened. Well, I certainly agree with John Glenn on that, but he goes on. Who was on the flight with Yulia Skripal, and did that person return to Moscow a few hours later? What happened to the what happened in the run-up to events here? And that would have involved other people. It would have not just involved Novichok coming here. How did it arrive here? This is all stunning stuff, Mike, isn't it? And he says this, and that would have involved other people, that Novichok coming here. And my thought on this is so many questions, but he said really he knew the answers because he had no doubt it was Russia.
It's staggering the parallels that can be drawn between the attitude of this Conservative Party representative and other Conservative Party representatives who, with regard to Syria, were prepared to make claims without any evidence, but the evidence was there, they said.
Yeah. And of course, we should never forget weapons of mass destruction. So I thought we'd just have a look at the Skripal story that the UK government would have us believe. I don't think I can do it any more simply than this, but I think this is the teller. So we've got Novichok used in Salisbury to poison Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Porton Down analyses samples, I'm going to say allegedly taken from the family house, because we have no proof anything provided to Porton Down actually came from any particular location, but we'll assume it came from the family house. The substance is formally identified by Porton Down as military-grade nerve agent, Novichok, but they're unable to say it was produced in Russia. Novichok is lethal. A lot of the papers are not talking about this anymore, Mike. They'll talk about it being a nerve agent, but this is a military-grade nerve agent designed to kill, in fact, in seconds or a few minutes from just skin contact or ingestion by a few milligrams. So this stuff is unbelievably dangerous. It's designed to kill. If you get it on you, you are going to die. So what happens in this case? Well, the UK government states that the Skripals are most likely to have had contact with the Novichok via the door handle.
This is the front door of their house?
The front door of their house,
The same front door that the police are standing beside without any protective
Well,
clothing?
we'll assume that it's been decontaminated by now, but the story is that the Skripals get a dose of military-grade nerve agent from the door handle of their home. They then get in their car, they go for a drink and they have a meal.
Right.
And they're fine. They're absolutely fine. But a few hours later, they're found rocking on a Salisbury bench. And according to one eyewitness that was reported not very widely, but a few papers did report this, they said that Yulia's eyes were simply white, i.e. her eyes were rolled up. She was shaking and rocking, as was her father. And she'd also soiled herself. So these are all indications of a dose of nerve agent. What happens then? Well, it's several hours now since they left home, but this is a poison designed to act in seconds.
Yes.
So they then wait there. There are delays until they're taken to hospital, and there are further delays until the nerve agent poisoning is determined in hospital. And then, was there any treatment? Well, it's pretty unlikely because there's no known antidote to Novichok. So look up this material yourself. So now we've got a couple who are showing signs of poisoning. They're in hospital. A policeman joins them because apparently he's been cross-contaminated from the Skripals themselves. No other person in contact with it or attending the Skripals ends up with problems. So they talk to people in the pub, they probably touch people in the pub, the restaurant, the ambulance crews handle them, the hospital handles them. Nobody else gets secondary nerve agent poisoning. And then a miracle. A few weeks later, Yulia, who's been poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent designed to kill in seconds, is apparently up and speaking in hospital.
Yes.
This story does not stack up. Vanessa, I don't know whether you might like just to comment on that. I've got to the point where I don't know how to make this simpler. Somebody's not telling the truth. Was Novichok used? I'm not convinced of this by the length of time the poisoning took to show and the fact that they're recovering from it. So what went on here? What's your view?
Well, I mean, I think those that have been working most in depth on this are Piers Robinson, Tim Hayward, and their working group. So I would recommend everybody goes to Tim Hayward's blog to catch up on their latest in-depth study on this entire case. But I mean, I think from my perspective, I mean, I've been a little bit more focused on what's happening in Syria than on this. I've only just been sort of keeping an eye on a periphery basis. But you know, if basically for me, if the UK government wanted to produce the best PR for Russia, it's just done it. Because, I mean, so far we're seeing the UK government backtracking on statements that they clearly made. They've apparently deleted their tweet. RT is just now, breaking news on Twitter, put out the fact that the UK Foreign Office denies claiming the nerve agent used in the Salisbury poisoning of the Skripals came directly from Russia, and have deleted the tweet, which a number of people, of course, had screenshot. And so now it's getting... It's creating a little tsunami on Twitter, let's say. So, you know, they're not going to get away with this. I mean, they basically created pure theatre under the full spotlight of public view. And they've been proven, I believe, to be lying. And effectively what they've done is actually given Russia the higher ground on this. And so if their intention was to discredit Russia or to use this entire event as a leverage, for example, for intervention inside Syria, which is what we suspected, and to somehow decelerate the liberation of Ghouta, they failed dismally to do that. I mean, we've just spoken about the fact that Ghouta is now effectively 100% liberated, just a few remaining pockets to be evacuated, but it's over. So for me, I mean, you know, it's just shambolic.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Vanessa. Absolutely. Now the question is, how has this happened? How has it happened that the government has presented information? Well, they have been caught with their trousers down, really. And we'll talk about that in a second in the response to this, because it's about control of the narrative, isn't it? It's about discussion, analysis of what they're saying, and the fact that people are critical of what they're saying and are taking it with a very major pinch of salt. So let's just look at this article for a start here. Now this is in the Daily Mail. It's by David Blunkett, the former Home Secretary. The title is, "I fear the crisis of violence on our streets now threatens British society in a way we have never seen before." This is the most cynical piece of propaganda. David Blunkett using the death of two youngsters in London. 48 people killed in London so far since the beginning of the year. This is a statistic which many people now saying puts London ahead of New York in terms of the number of violent deaths. But two young people killed. And he's saying, I fear this crisis of violence, as I say, on our streets now threatens British society. As far as the police know, he says the shooting of Tanisha Milburn is more or less random. About an hour after her killing, police were called to Walthamstow, where a youth of 16 died after being shot and another 15-year-old was stabbed. He subsequently died, sadly. The staggering statistics are that 48 people have been murdered in the capital. He says that London and New York not only have populations of similar sizes, about 8 million, but a similar annual police budget, about 3 billion, and therefore it's fair to make comparisons between the two. And he comments on the number of police that are on the streets. But then he goes on to say that he believes the crisis of violence in our street threatens British society on a scale not seen before. But to my mind, he says, the biggest difference between violent crime today and when I was in government is the dangerous influence of social media. Right, this is his position, the dangerous influence of social media. Viral videos make the unthinkable seem normal in no time at all. I believe this is the only explanation for the horrific increase in acid attacks over the past 2 years, for example. We have to empower everyone in communities concerned to stand up and say we'll not accept these deaths on our streets any longer. Crucially, we need to take action. We need action, by social media platforms which now bear such a heavy burden of responsibility for the carnage taking place on the streets. So people are dying in increasing numbers for no other reason than it's being discussed on social media, according to him. So that's a certain level of hysteria from David Blunkett. And then we have France. So this is Jean-Yves Le Drian. He was saying in December that, ladies and gentlemen, we're living in a period of unprecedented propaganda. Misinformation is not a new phenomenon, but the digital revolution and its effects on the way that public opinion, and particularly our youth, is informed, gives us pause. And so they have launched this event, Civil Societies, Media and States, Democracies Facing Misinformation and Media Manipulation. It's on Twitter live from live this afternoon at 3 p.m. CET, so that'll be 2 p.m. UK time. And details on screen there. Who's speaking at it? Well, we've got Damien Collins, who of course is Member of Parliament and Chairman of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Parliamentary Select Committee. A number of other people there you can see on screen. But we also have Christophe Douar, who's Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders. And that's quite interesting because by coincidence today, Reporters Without Borders have launched their Journalism Trust initiative. This is an innovative media self-regulatory initiative designed to combat disinformation online. It is designed to promote journalism by adherence to an agreed set of trust and transparency standards to be developed and implemented. This will happen by means of the so-called workshop agreement of the European Centre for Standardisation, which was opened on the 3rd of April 2018 for participation by interested stakeholders, for example, media outlets, professional associations and unions, self-regulatory entities like press councils and regulatory bodies, as well as digital platforms, advertisers, and consumer interest representatives. Christophe Douar says, in the new public arena system in which false information circulates faster than real news, the defense of journalism requires reversing this trend by giving a real advantage to those who reliably produce news and information, whatever their status. So that they have launched that. And in a couple of weeks' time, in Brussels, we have disinformation, the playbook and how to fight it. This is a 2018 Brussels Disinfo Lab on next Wednesday, in fact. This is together the EU and the Atlantic Council. They are cordially inviting people to their second annual disinformation event. Well, who's going to be speaking at that? A guy called Andy Price, who is head of counter-disinformation at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Now, this is very interesting because I had never heard that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office had a counter-disinformation department. And so I went looking for it today, and strangely enough, Brian, I couldn't find it. There's no mention of it on the Foreign Office website. There's no mention of it on the government website. The earliest mention I can find of Adrian Price or the role in the media is from September 2017. So this looks like a new position has been established within the British government, head of counter disinformation. That's fantastic.
Yeah, counter disinformation, and we've already got the biggest applied behavioural psychology system within the British government the world has ever seen, so effective that the techniques to manipulate populations in their views and values and belief structures has been sold on to the Americans and the Australians. And now we've got effectively, we've got a declaration, we've got a minister of propaganda now.
Absolutely, but it doesn't end there, because the National saying that anti-fake news laws could be the only way to counter disinformation. So we're not going to do it on a voluntary basis. We're going to impose laws. Of course, this is from UAE, and you've got to take that into account. But nonetheless, Vanessa, what are your thoughts on this? This is a pretty hysterical response to the fact that they have lost control of the narrative, and the Skripal case is just one example of that.
Yeah, I mean, they've lost control of the narrative in Syria. I mean, as we were predicting, leading up to the liberation of East Aleppo, they would be exposed for the charlatans they are and for the shills for British and US and EU state propaganda. We're seeing it again in Eastern Ghouta. We saw the hyperbole, we saw the sensationalism and the hysteria leading up to and during the Syrian Army campaign to liberate those areas. Now, what do we see? We see tumbleweed, because they know perfectly well that the testimony that is being given, like, for example, by the lady that you showed in the beginning of today's program, are going to be exposing them for the terrorist apologists that they have been throughout this 7-year war. So on so many levels, the anti-Corbyn rhetoric that we've seen being led yet again by the UK Foreign Office mouthpiece, The Guardian, which seems to be sort of ahead of all the others at the moment in spouting UK government propaganda, particularly, as we know, the demonising of Jeremy Corbyn for basically taking a principled and strong stance against the disinformation. Yeah. And so, what is extraordinary, I mean, we're just entering a kind of Orwellian world of thought control, where fundamentally we're being told, because if you consider that social media represents the public, right? If they're saying that all of this evil is emanating from social media, as opposed to what is emanating from social media is a thorn in their side, is a recognition of their lies by the public, then what they're saying is we need to control this, we need to contain it, because it's now becoming too powerful. The Syrian war has been a perfect example of how in real time their lies are being exposed through social media. We've not really experienced that on this scale before. And I think it's, we also have to understand that to a large extent they did create these social media platforms. So we have to assume they had an inkling that this might happen. But whether they had taken into account the extent to which it would gather momentum and actually turn into a weapon to be used against them, I don't know. But it's insane. I mean, no right-thinking human being should accept a control over their ability to judge a situation should come from a centralized, globally recognized power base. I mean, this is just, it's something that I think all of us had read about previously, but never thought we would actually be heading towards, and we are.
But Vanessa, I think to put a positive side to this, the speed and the scale at which the states are ramping up this response tells me they are very, very frightened at the speed which people are now beginning to put quite major geopolitics together and explain it to each other in a sensible way. This is truly terrifying. And I think some of the ridiculous stuff that's come out of the Skripal case has come out because, of course, one, we know the Conservatives, to take a small example, the Conservatives were boasting a few years ago about creating a period of what they called creative destruction and chaos in the public services. So we can see chaos coming in all around us. They are now beginning to suffer from that chaos themselves because, of course, they've lost control in certain ways over their own people. I think this is fear by the wider geopolitical state.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what was interesting, I mean, I think it was Paul Mason was tweeting out today a number of tweets on the Skripal case, trying to scramble back some credibility for the British government. And I think one tweet he actually said, we should trust the government. And I just checked now, and I'm pretty certain he's deleted that tweet because it was basically mobbed by tweets from the public saying, are you kidding us? You know, why on earth should we trust the UK government? I mean, this is, you know, as I said, if they wanted to do PR for Russia, they couldn't have done a better job because, you know, they've exposed themselves and they've shown Russia to really be, you know, the sensible international broker in all of these affairs.
Okay, well, look, we'll just remind everybody of the Media on Trial event. Vanessa, you will be speaking at it on the 27th of May in Leeds. Details on mediaontrial.uk and tickets as well. Tickets are £10. Vanessa, the question that's being asked is, has the media, the mainstream media in the UK, is it in breach of the Terrorism Act through their embedding themselves with terrorists in their coverage in the Middle East? And also through the promotion of terrorist narratives. Just a couple of minutes on that, a couple of seconds on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think this is a very important question. I mean, and certainly when we raised this question, we had a huge kickback on social media from journalist organizations, including some of the latest hit pieces against myself and Eva Bartlett. And so I would say that it is certainly worth exploring. Certainly we've seen Guardian journalists in particular, but CNN, also Ardwa Damon, Clarissa Ward, basically working alongside and, let's say, producing and promoting the terrorist faction narratives in a number of areas of Syria, particularly in the beginning. I mean, I'm now working on a project here in Syria and covering the early propaganda that came out of Baba Amra in Homs, where actually much of the, let's say, the so-called revolution narrative was produced and incubated. And when you look at the number of media operations that were working out of that area, and embedded with what was then euphemistically called the Free Syrian Army, who were still committing terrorist atrocities against civilians in that area. So it's a very important, I think, you know, it's an important, however we frame this question, I think we should certainly be questioning whether journalists have an ethical responsibility to avoid being embedded with internationally recognized terrorist groups, let alone lionizing their atrocities against the peoples in whatever theatre of intervention we're talking about.
Yes, okay, thank you. That's on the 27th of May. Get along to that if possible. Now, sticking with the fake news sort of issue, we have Facebook saying authenticity matters. The IRA has no place on Facebook. This, of course, has nothing to do with Irish terrorism. This is to do with the so-called Russian-based Internet Research Agency. So they have removed 70 Facebook pages, 70 Facebook accounts, 65 Instagram accounts, 138 Facebook pages that they say were controlled by the Internet Research Agency. Many of the pages also ran ads, they say, all of which have been removed. Well, they say they'd like to share more about these pages and who was behind them. We're looking into the best way to provide more transparency into what the IRA has done. In the next few weeks, we'll be updating our help centre. So I'll just skip this one, but Ben Nimmo here saying one thing which betrays genuine Russian troll factory accounts is the language, apparently, and if you don't use proper grammar, then you're probably a troll account, apparently. So in this case, he's singling out Russian speakers who perhaps don't have articles as part of their language, and so they don't use the and a in sentences. But of course, we're talking about Twitter here, and many people that are using Twitter are still remembering Twitter from the 140 character days when articles were dropped as a matter of course, because
I'm afraid I do it all the time, Mike.
Absolutely. So yeah. Does that make you a Russian troll, Brian?
Well, I hope not.
So there you go. But Ben Nimmo, Atlantic Council, of course, he must know what he's up to. Now, just briefly, Vanessa, I wanted to get your opinion on this. This is from Homeland Security Today.us. Perspective to truly fight terror, counter Salafist Jihadist ideology first. And what they're saying is now that the Islamic State has fallen and lost the battle to the ground, on the ground, it's time to seriously consider the next steps to win the fight against terrorism in the long run. A recent report by the Soufan Center has traced back 5,600 ISIS foreign fighters who returned home. While the returning foreign fighters may not try to carry out attacks immediately, there's no doubt that many of them will certainly be the seeds of future recruits or act as organisers and facilitators in the name of ISIS. Now, I apologise, I had the slides in slightly the wrong order, so we need to jump back to this one because they cite this report here, Perspectives on Terrorism. This is from the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And the point that they're making here is, and I quote, the majority of the ISIS imams and teachers who were preaching in ISIS-controlled territories and schools in Syria were from Saudi Arabia. And they say Wahhabi teachings around the world with Saudi-supported imams have established the grounds for easier jihadist terrorism recruitment. Now, the point here is, of course, Vanessa, Saudi Arabia absolutely supported in its work by the British government. And as many people have made the point, when certain types of ideology come into British mosques, with it comes the Saudi-funded and Saudi-sponsored imams. So this is not something that is just happening in Syria, it's happening right across the world. But the British government is in bed with Saudi Arabia. So my question is, where is this policy coming from?
Well, I mean, this policy is a long-standing one. I mean, if you speak to any of the faith leaders here, particularly the Grand Mufti, Ahmad Hassoun, he has been warning the EU and the UK for many years now that they're allowing the radicalization of Muslim communities in all of these countries. So it's where exactly this radicalization program is coming from is very difficult to tell, but certainly those Wahhabi doctrine teachers are coming, yes, from Saudi Arabia. Have they infiltrated Muslim communities? Yes, they have. Who is financing and funding them and allowing them to do it, and to what end, is a relatively difficult question to answer right now. But we have to say, as you rightly say, not only the UK, I mean, France is also, don't forget, supplying arms to Qatar. They awarded the Légion d'honneur medal to bin Nayef of Saudi Arabia. We know also that now Saudi Arabia and Israel are working very much in lockstep. We've seen that in Syria. We've seen the Saudis and the Israelis get much closer, and we can see parallels running in their various destabilization campaigns in the Middle East region, for example. So, I guess the threat is always there that these radicalized cells can be triggered in any European country at any given moment. And we've seen it recently. I mean, the recent attack in Carcassonne by an alleged ISIS adherent, what did it lead to? It's basically led to French troops on the ground inside Syria, just as the US claims that it's leaving. So we see them being used for a multiple of purposes. In this case, obviously, as we saw previously with some of the terrorist attacks in France, were then followed by bombing in Syria.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that.
All right, well, we'll end on this particular article, and I'm going to say this is not something I normally do, as I'll explain why, but we felt on this subject it was worth doing. So let's have a look at this. This is as part of an anonymous letter received by the UK column. It said, UK column news, March the 20th, 2018, at 15 minutes you said she was attacked by a gang of girls on a bus in Nottingham. The colour of her skin, the innuendo being that this was, let's highlight that bit, the innuendo being that this was whites attacking an innocent foreigner. Brian, that was a pack of 10 British women of African descent, and the police are more than happy to prosecute whites if they even look askance at a black or Muslim. So stop bullshitting your audience on the race question. Your clarification of this news item awaited on UK column news in early course. Well, I'm going to say that we find anonymous letters very often to be offensive. We know that sometimes people have to give us anonymous information to protect a whistleblowing source. We understand that. But if you've got something to say to us, then at least have the courage to put your name to the letter. You see our faces, you know who we are. We expect the same courtesy back. But what was fascinating about this article was the whole tone of it. Now, what was the person talking about? Well, it was this report. And I was picking up on the fact that an Egyptian girl had been attacked by a group of girls on a bus in Nottingham. And although she was taken to hospital and released, she later died. What I found despicable about this report was the BBC said, well, don't worry, this is not a hate-related crime. And my caption at the time was that a girl is brutally attacked and dies, but it's not hate-related. It's not hate-related. And what I'm getting at is the fact that we now have the political manipulation of speech to affect the way we look at what happens to our human beings. But it's quite clear to me that as I read through the letter sent to us and the package of information, that is all about hate. But let's just come into this area because I think we need to pick at it a bit. Here's the definition of hate crime. A crime motivated by racial, sexual, or other prejudice, typically one involving violence. Legislation to stiffen penalties for persons convicted of hate crime. Now, I think this is highly manipulated political language. If somebody is attacked on a bus, we don't need to know what race they are. We can perhaps assume, though, that the person who attacked them, unless it was in absolute self-defense, has got some hate-type motive. So my attack was on the language of the BBC in demeaning the death of this young lady by saying, well, it's not a hate crime.
So it's not important?
It's not important. But with the material we received, and people can freeze this on screen to have a look at it, we've got an article from Cairo. It talks about the girl dying, and it does indeed say she was brutally beaten by 10 British women of African descent. Now, this has been highlighted by the person who sent it in, not by me. It goes on to say that the mother claimed the assault was race motivated. She said 4 months ago, 2 of the same 10 women abused my daughter in the street with no specific reason. So this mother, quite rightly, is complaining that the police and the British government have not taken the right responses. But that is not the primary interest of the person who sent this material in, because much of the other material is all to do with attacks on immigrants and people of different colours and people who are taking, what is the word, benefits from Islington Council. So this is really classic stuff. I think that we've got really what this is all about. I was trying to warn that language is being manipulated in order to create a problem in this country. We have foreigners and immigrants. What is that all about? Well, of course, we know that people like Peter Sutherland, who died fairly recently, was boasting that we needed mass migration to break down traditional countries. This is about creating internal division, hatred, and ultimately violence on the streets. And it is divide and rule. And my impression of the anonymous letter sent to us and the other content is that the aim of this person is to try and ramp up that hate. So what are they trying to do to us that we're going to be so busy attacking each other we won't have time to actually pull the British government to account for lying as it did ultimately over weapons of mass destruction, what's taken place in Libya, what's taken place in Syria and the Yemen. We're not going to be focusing on that because we're going to be too busy fighting amongst ourselves on the streets. So I'm going to say to Miss or Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous, if you want a response from the UK column in future, then put your name on the letter and a proper address. But I think you have utterly fallen into the trap the government and the BBC wants. You are in the battle on the streets designed to destroy all of us. And I could probably say that with more passion, Mike, I think.
So we're done?
I think we're done. Vanessa, thanks very much for joining us. Just a brief reminder to people, May the 12th, the Albert Hall in Nottingham is that NHS event. Tickets are now starting to go. So if you haven't bought your ticket yet, please do that. This will be the most unique event on the NHS there has ever been in this country. And I think it is going to cause a number of follow-up events. Be there. I think you need to be. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
What are you giggling at?
So